This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io.
Hey everybody, welcome to another Ruby Rogues episode. This week on our panel, we have just me. So everybody else is out, and we have a very special guest. Her name is Sihui Huang. Sihui Huang. And it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Eric.
Well, to start off, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, totally. I'm currently a backend engineer at Gusto. Gusto is a startup at San Francisco. We do payrolls benefit in HR. It's a SaaS company. We have been about 6 years old. So we started with a Rails monolith app, and we're still a Rails monolith app. So on my day-to-day, I have been working on the payments engineering team. Basically, anything related to money movement is what my team does. So basically, just have been working with a pretty old Rails app, mostly writing Ruby day-to-day.
How old would you say it is?
The app itself?
Are you still running on an older version of Rails, or?
Oh, we are running Rails 4, I believe.
Okay. And how many Rails developers are there?
The whole engineering team is about 90 engineers. We are hiring and we are growing really fast. But we don't normally specify like Rails engineer versus like JavaScript engineer. Mostly we consider ourselves full stack, but because my team is heavily backend, so we do mostly backend stuff. That's Ruby, yeah.
That's great. And so how long have you been programming in Ruby?
I would say a little bit, about 3 years in total.
Okay, very cool. And before that?
This is actually my first job out of college. So I have 3 internships before Gusto, one with a small startup at Dallas called Elixir. It's like a software firm. So I did a little bit Rails and then Swift with iOS and a little bit Android. And then have 2 internships with Salesforce, also in San Francisco. One in the performance engineering team, another one with a IoT team. It's kind of like a startup within Salesforce. I
see. So why Ruby after all of that, after all those internships with different languages? Why did you land on Ruby?
Totally. I actually learned Ruby for my first internship, and the feeling I got is that when I write Ruby, it's a lot like, it feels a lot like talking to a friend. It's just so descriptive and just so fun and easy to use.
Yeah, I found that as well. In fact, recently I've been going through a transition, which, as I understand you are as well, of moving away from Ruby more into Elixir. And I find myself reaching back to what I find comfortable, which is Ruby, because Elixir is so much more strict on how you write things. It makes it a little bit more difficult at times. So I do want to delve into that, but you wrote a really cool article on how to contribute to Ruby. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So earlier this year, I was invited to an event in UK by Cookpack. It's called Ruby Hack Day. Basically, they brought together a bunch of a few Ruby developers and a few Ruby core contributors, including Matt himself. So the contributors that attended are Matt and Koichi, who is now currently working on Concurrency on Ruby, and also I don't know if I can pronounce his name right, Yosuke. He's working on type tracking related stuff in Ruby currently. So this is an event that brings a few Ruby core contributors and a few Ruby developers together and show us how to develop Ruby, basically. It's a pretty cool event. Yeah.
It was that. So I know that you spent a little bit of time with Matt on that. Do you know roughly how they construct Ruby. Can you kind of enlighten us on that? And also tell us about your experience with Mats.
Yeah, totally. I would say Mats is definitely very friendly. So after the event, we traveled together from Bristol to Bath for dinner, for a speaker dinner for the Bath Ruby conference. And I was able to very luckily get to chat with Matt during the trip. And Matt's really friendly. Matt was very friendly, and I basically asked him lots of questions that I have related to Ruby, such as like how he think of type checking and where Ruby is going. But to answer your first questions about how Ruby, like the core team behind it, how they work, basically, I think they use, I'd say it's Matt and the core team, they have a vision. For example, for Rails 3, they mainly focus on performance, concurrency, and type related stuff. So they basically have a vision and they're trying to achieve it for the next big releases. At the meantime, they have those weekly meetings where people get together either remotely or in Japan. But one thing they do really well is they document each meeting. It's all available in, let me try to find the website. But they document all the meeting and document in forms of Google Docs. So everyone who's interested to see how they made decisions in terms of how, as detailed as how they name a new method, you can find all the discussions in those Google Docs. So I really appreciate that they're trying to keep all the decision making as open as possible. So for people who is not able to attend the meeting can also take a look and see how the considerations they put into making those decisions.
So you mentioned that the three focuses that they have on Ruby 3 are performance, concurrency, and like a type system.
Mm-hmm.
Just on those, do you have any more information on like how far along that is, or what are your thoughts on that? As far as performance, I understand. As far as a type system, I think there's like pros and cons to that, and I've heard arguments both ways. I personally think it's great because it allows you to know exactly like what's coming, and it's preventative coding, right? Preventative errors. And finally, the concurrency. But the concurrency story I'm just curious about, and that's what led me to Elixir, is the concurrency aspect of it. How likely do you see them becoming comparable to languages like Elixir or other, core, like natively concurrent languages?
To be honest, I haven't done much research into how Ruby is doing, how Ruby is trying to achieve concurrency currently. But in my understanding, it's really hard for any object-oriented language to achieve the same level of concurrency as a functional programming language is able to do. Because they are all thread-based. In my understanding, it just as long as you have objects that points to like the shared memory by different objects, it's really hard to get concurrency right. I think that's one of the reasons why Elixir's creator, Jose, originally started to create Elixir. Originally, he was a core contributor for the Rails team and also looking into multi-threading and concurrency related issue. And the deeper he dived into it, the deeper he realized how hard it is. And he started to look into other programming paradigm. That's how he settled with functional programming languages and started to building Elixir. So in my understanding, it's going to be hard, but there are still a lot of work can improve and provide more support around it. But whoever is trying to use trying to leverage concurrency or multi-threading in Ruby, I think a lot of things you need to still be careful about. But there are definitely like rooms for improvement and leverage concurrency and multi-threading and multi-core, all those things.
So based on what you just said, you see Ruby having a very long-term future as one of the primary web-based languages.
Totally, yeah. Just seeing how many startups or small companies being able to ship like big projects that impacts like so many people with a small team. That's totally one thing that Ruby and the Rails community that has the biggest advantage, being able to ship fast and leverage a small team and build a product that have big impact. I think that's one of the things Matt himself believe in as well, because in his keynote for the Best Ruby conference, he emphasized like the thing he believes in is like have faster execution and actually write less code and build a smaller team. So I don't see Matt being a big believer into having a big team. He's like much more aligned with DHH in terms of having a small team that does a lot and not necessarily even with lots of code. So definitely Ruby is not going anywhere, and it has been like made developers' life a lot easier and just basically made us more impactful with small team and less amount of code.
Yeah, that's true. I built my career. I've been programming for about 20 years now, and half of that was in Ruby.
Wow.
And so every now and then I'd kind of go off the path and try something else. And then I'd always come back. Then I'd go off the path and try something else and always come back. But I found that if you are disciplined enough to kind of stick to the Rails way and stick to how the leaders are doing it, it becomes a very scalable, very approachable way to build software. And I stand behind you on that. I think it is around for the long term. I do think that they have their challenges, but there are some really smart people working on it.
Yeah, totally. There are a lot of smart and nice people working on it. But one thing I would like to point out is that the philosophy of having small team that build a product that have big impact, that philosophy is not so much just software development, though. It's also a philosophy on the business level. You need to get buy-in from the whole company to believe in. You don't necessarily have to scale the team so much in order to have a big product or in order to enable the company to grow for the next 5 years or so. If you look at it, like DHH is a big, DHH being the creator of Rails, is a big believer in small teams, and the team behind Basecamp is pretty small. But nowadays, a lot of companies out there, especially in Silicon Valley, people are really growth focused. And one assumption people have is that if you want to grow your company, you may also want to grow your team pretty quickly. But as developers, we all know developers don't scale very well. But if the business don't inherit the same mindset, meaning you don't actually need to grow your development team so much. Instead, they go to the other routes, like we want to fight 2x for the next year. Let's also 2x our development team. Then you kind of run into a lot of troubles in terms of your code base may not be as well maintained, and just a lot of things that both Matt and DHS doesn't really consider day to day. You will run into trouble of those things. One example may be we find it kind of hard to refactor Ruby code. One reason being it's a dynamic programming language. There are not lots of good toolings around it as the toolings we have around Java, because Java is like static type. It's a lot easier to build those refactoring tools around it. And as your team grow, as your code base grow, if you are not careful to have like proper testing and all that, refactoring a Ruby code base can be quite challenging. And that's not something, I don't think that's something on top of Matt's mind or DHS mind, to be honest, because I think they deal with smaller teams on a daily basis. So they may not understand the pain of like having a bigger team or having a pretty large legacy code base that have been many years long. So you run into challenge in those areas.
Do you think they should feel that pain or should have an understanding of that? I'd
say the first thing is it all go back to the philosophy. Like Matt really wants to emphasize, like by our conversation, he really wants to emphasize like developer happiness and having smaller team. So in order for them to kind of have more focus in terms of the toolings and supporting and solving problems around large team using Rails code, it's going to be a mindset shift for them to see, even though bigger or medium-sized team maybe it's not as aligned as their philosophy, but there are a lot of developers out there are facing those issues. Another thing I found quite interesting is that by talking to those core contributors, I realized none of them actually code in Ruby in a day-to-day basis, because they're contributing to the Ruby source code base, which is C. So they deal with C a lot more than actually use Ruby in their day-to-day code base. So that's something I find pretty interesting. And that's also why Matt goes to lots of Ruby conferences and talked to a lot of Ruby developers to get a sense of like how Ruby is going, if Ruby is solving their problem, things like that. But I find it pretty interesting that many core contributors don't use Ruby itself. But of course, there are a lot of other Ruby contributors use them too. But it's just interesting to see that some of them don't use Ruby on a day-to-day basis.
That's like being an auto manufacturer that doesn't drive a car, right? Somebody working there and doesn't actually have a car themselves.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Just to be fair, though, I asked Matt why. He said he would rather to improve the language and let Ruby developer to enjoy the language more, other than himself enjoying it, but don't have enough time to contribute to the language.
I did have the pleasure of meeting him a handful of years back, and you're right. He is just a fantastic individual, very giving, very humble. So, yeah, it was a pretty cool experience meeting him. I'm pretty jealous that you got to sit in a train with him for that long and that. So let's talk a little bit about the type checking. I know that that is a feature that they're pushing for Rails Ruby 3, which who knows how far out it is. What benefits come from that you can see?
I would say the main reason Max wants to support some kind of type checking is that to have compilers or something similar to detect errors at compile time. So I think I would say that's one of the benefit of having a type checking system, especially as the app grows, the team grows. Having that is going to be really beneficial to shorten the feedback loop. If something is wrong, immediately, so you don't have to wait for tags for the user to tell you what's wrong. I actually checked with Matt on the type checking system. He envisioned quite a bit during the trip. It's really interesting to hear his point of view. So his vision he has this vision for a future compiler. He believes that in the future, programmers don't have to tell the compiler about types, but the compiler just can detect what the types should be based on a compile time. He doesn't have a clear approach to how we can accomplish that yet, but he's like pretty convinced that that's how the future is going to be like. He's thinking maybe it's by the text you wrote or by some other things that the compiler can tell what the types of the program should be. But he's pretty convinced that in the future, compiler you don't have to tell the compiler what it should be, but the compiler just know. And that's actually one reason why he strongly opposed the idea of actually having code along with your code base that declares the type. For example, let me back off a bit. So that's why he strongly opposed the idea of declaring type in real program, because he believed that once you add it there, it's really hard to remove. When the future compiler comes in, then all those Ruby code now is not compatible with that future compiler. So he thinks that having a separate file to declare it is acceptable. It's still not ideal, but so far he find it maybe that's the only way. Either having a separate file along with some comment in the real business code, but definitely not like have some programmatic code in your business code that declare types for you.
Are they prototyping this at all?
Yeah. This is a gem or a library started by someone that's not currently on the Ruby core team, but I believe Matt is thinking about bringing him in the core team as well. But the library is called Steep, just STEEP. If you Google Steep or Steep Ruby type, you should be able to find it. So this is a prototype where to use it, you need to have a separate file to declare your types. And the core team is looking into use that as a prototype to see if that's something they can do.
That's awesome.
And yeah, I believe Yusuke is the core team member looking into this.
Very good. Now, I know I watched your video of the conference talk that you recently gave at the Taiwan Ruby X, and it was an Elixir conference. And you talked about the bugs and how many bugs you've built that you've created over the years. And I found that interesting because you said I've done this many bugs probably, and it was probably 40 bugs. And I'm thinking to myself, I have at least 5,000. I mean, it'd be like ants on that page for me. But how do you think this type checking system might help in that area?
Yeah, totally. So to give the listeners some context, the talk is about how, because I'm working in the payments team and we literally, the code we write is moving people's money. So each bug may actually cost lots of money. That's why we have been extremely careful and follow best practice and have come up with a set of best practice that we follow in terms to make sure that we handling all those money correctly. And go back to the type trapping system. One best practice we follow is called defensive programming. And we use a gem called contracts. What it does is it allows you to declare, basically for each method, you can declare the type of the input and the type of the output. It's really straightforward. It's just two lines of code, one line of code before each method. And the way it works is that it doesn't detect your errors in compile time. What it does is if your tags or any of your real code that goes through that method but doesn't obey that contract, it will throw an error immediately. And that has been extremely helpful to us because sometimes with the help of this gem, if someone use our code that doesn't pass an argument that obey what the program expects, it will throw an error like as early as possible. So it makes debugging and catching error much more easier. Now go back to the type checking topic we are talking about. I think if we have something that's built in from Ruby, that's gonna basically we don't have to use a separate gem and we may not even have to think about it. It will just support out of the gate. I think for something as if your program is very have a big impact and have is a critical part of your program, as for us it's like moving money, then you want something similar.
That makes sense. So let's shift the tables around a little bit. I want to talk about your move slowly from Ruby over to the Elixir world. What's your first impression of that? Like, let's say you're in for a little bit, a month later. Like, tell me about your first impression of Elixir, how it compares to your Ruby experience, and some of the pros and cons that you can see out of the gate.
Mm-hmm. Totally. It's funny because I actually decided to try out Elixir because I went to that conference in Taiwan. It's a Ruby plus Elixir conference. So it's like part of the program is Ruby, part of the program is Elixir. And I got to talk to a lot of Elixir developers during the conference and hear their perspective. And then that got me interested into trying it out. So I'm still a Ruby developer and I mostly just play around with Elixir in my free time after work. About my impressions of Elixir, I'd say it's really nice to see both Elixir and Ruby come from the same root. Like one of the common philosophy they share is that Ruby is really believing in developers' happiness, and Elixir, one of the core focus is about improving developers' productivity. So playing around with a language where its main focus is to serve the developer community, that itself feels really nice. Another thing I would say, of course, the big difference between Ruby and Elixir is that Ruby is an object-oriented programming language, and Elixir is more like a functional programming language. And just trying out the functional way of thinking is quite fascinating because originally I'm quite a fan of OO programming. Originally, my thought was that it makes a lot of sense if you think of the world as different objects and they interact with each other, and each object is very well encapsulated about what they can do and what they know. It just makes sense for me from that mental model. But as I play around with the functional paradigm a little bit more, what I feel is that the biggest difference is that I don't have to think about responsibility so much. Earlier, back in the OO world, especially in a big code base, when I try to add a new method, I sometimes have to think about which objects should know about it, which objects should own that responsibility. And sometimes it's quite hard to define and to allocate that responsibility correctly. And if you don't allocate it correctly, it may be quite hard to move around and refactor that part of that method you want to add later. Because if you attach to an object and you later realize, oh, actually, it shouldn't be attached to this object. Then you have to go through all the code to move it out. And also it may be too deeply integrated with that object. Then there's just too many code depend on that method being on that object itself. But on the functional way, I don't think so much about who is responsible for what, but it's more like, I just want to get this thing done. And I can just write a method to get it done. Because the contract between method is so simple and also strict. It just like pass me some data and I give you back some data. And all of the methods living in the functional programming world knows that it's immutable. We are not changing anything. You have the confidence of, I don't have to think about responsibility so much. I can just think about how I want to get this thing done that I want to code out. And later on, if you want to move around method, it's not so hard at all because everything like functions are first-class citizens in the functional programming world. You can move around pretty easily. They just like group by different modules, and then you just move one method from one module to another one. That seems pretty not as don't have a big overhead as the ways you have to do in the OO world. So that's one thing I really I find quite like a light bulb comes up. So like, oh, that's actually quite interesting. And one big reason I want to try out Elixir is more as use it as an opportunity to try out functional programming. People say a lot of the conversation I have with people who move to Elixir is a lot of time they say in the beginning they would have to spend some time to get themselves warmed up with Elixir, and the learning curve may be a little bit steep, but once they fully get ran with it and get warmed up with it, they find themselves like even more productive than using Ruby. Even though they may have 5 or 10 years of Ruby experience, but they find themselves more productive in Ruby. That's something that caught my interest a lot. Just being able to be more productive and do more with less time. So that's another reason I want to look into Elixir as well.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/rubyrogues.
A couple of questions kind of came to me as you were talking. And I'm gonna ask them both because I'm gonna forget them. The first thing is being more productive. I'm gonna say that's a little bit hard to swallow. That they would be more productive when the Ruby community, the gems and libraries and open source code out there that makes building applications so rapid. Doesn't quite exist yet in the Elixir community. So I guess it's more of an observation where I'm like, because I've heard that too. Yeah. I just wonder, like, how is that possible? And in my experience, it has not been that case yet. However, I can see like the stability of what you build is more long-term. So perhaps maybe that has to do with it. And the other question I had was regarding the functional coding versus object-oriented coding, and that single, that sense of responsibility and where it goes. I guess the only question I really have, aside from the comment prior, is does that lead you to more disorganized code? Whereas in Ruby, if you do have objects with single responsibility, everything goes, how it should go. How does that impact your code structure and your locations of functions in Elixir when you're moving away from that?
Yeah, both are great questions. And I actually think about those questions myself as well. So let's talk about the first one related to productivity. I myself haven't spent enough time with Elixir to feel that I'm more productive in Elixir. Sometimes when I code in Elixir, I still get the feeling that I know exactly what I need to do, how exactly to achieve this task if I can code in Ruby. But with Elixir, I need to think about it and all that. And you brought up a good point about the Ruby community with all these gems and this all this support from the community is fantastic. And that's one of the criticize I hear a lot about Elixir or the community is that you don't have that many supports. You have to kind of rebuild the wheel for yourself even if you just want to do a simple thing. I personally don't have experience using Elixir in a commercial app setting. Right now, just myself playing around with it. But I do hear some people who use it, and I ask them these questions. And one person who told me is that they do run into a few issues with non-existent or underdeveloped library in the Elixir ecosystem. But they said that once they got used to the type checking and pattern matching, he thinks that it is still a net productivity gain. I think in the end of the day, there are pros and cons. The cons may be you lack those libraries, but because the functional paradigm or the type checking makes you write code and read code a lot faster and maybe even help you to develop a code structure that's a lot more scalable. And if you sum this up, maybe for some people, it's a net productivity gain.
I see a parallel there with all of these front-end frameworks versus Elm. Mm-hmm. So Elm is also a very functional-based front-end framework, but it's not even a framework, really. There's not a lot of, as far as I understand, there's not a huge community around building Elm plugins or whatever you call them. And fully admitting, I'm not an Elm programmer, but I believe one of our panelists on this show or the Elixir show, I can't remember which, but is heavy into Elm. And same type of response I hear from them, where once you start using Elm, it really makes it impossible to move out of anything else. And I'm wondering if it's very similar, where you go into this parallel mindset where now everything makes sense. You don't have to have this cognitive overhead to maintain this project. All you need to do is say, okay, what's my input? What's my output? And the whole thing is pretty much pure functions. So yeah, I totally see the value in that for sure. We should probably stop talking about Elixir since we're a Ruby show. If you are interested in Elixir, though, I am also on a podcast called Elixir Mix, and you can find us at devchat.tv. So anyway, I just had to plug that real quick.
I'm actually a fan of that show as well. I listen to both of your shows.
Oh, good. I'm glad. All right, let's talk about contributions to open source. What's your experience with that? I know that some of your notes show that you do have some experience in open source contribution. Let's talk about that. Like what got you started in that? What have you done? And what's your overall thoughts on it?
Yeah, totally. It's funny that how I'm starting to go to different conferences this year, and I've been to 3 so far, and each of them have different impact on me. The latest one being the Taiwan one kind of introduced me to Elixir. And the second one is actually the one introduced me to the open source community. The second one is the one in Bath, UK, the one where I met Matt and a lot of other Ruby contributor, and there are a lot of other open source contributor within the Rails ecosystem are there, like contributors for Rails and for Ruby and other popular library. To be honest, I don't have too many open source contributing experience. I actually just started this year. The reason being, I always feel that you have to be a rockstar developer in order to contribute to open source library, especially the popular ones that so many companies and developers depend on, like Rails or Ruby or any programming languages or web framework. So I always feel maybe I'm just not up for the task. But after talking to all those open source software contributors, a common theme I realized is that they just kind of started somewhere. They just poke around with the library and they use it themselves and they enjoy using it. And then they see small improvement they can make. And then they just submit pull requests and you get accepted. And then they kind of get into the loop of just keep doing it. Maybe not thinking I have to carve out 10% of my time to dedicate it to it. But it's more like a side hobby. It's like, the same way as you may think, let me check out what new musics are there. Let me try out that new song and see if it fits my ear. It's very similar for them in the beginning. They were like, maybe in a Sunday afternoon, you don't have anything to do. You think about, actually, there's one improvement I can make. Or let me check out their issue pages and see any small tickets I can pick up. So the common thing I found is that they all started really small and gradually over the years, they become a core contributor. that just made the whole thing less intimidating to me. And so far, my experience into contributing to open source ecosystem are mainly just contributing to Elixir. It's actually a funny story because I also, when I was playing around with Elixir, and then I realized, oh, this is probably a bug. And then I just have create a thread in the Elixir community, the forum online. And there's like, I think this is a bug or something like that. And then the next day I saw someone tweeted there's a new issue come out in the Elixir GitHub project that says this is a bug and it's a starter ticket. Someone can just take it. And because I woke up a little bit late that day, someone already claimed that ticket. I was like, oh, damn it. I would be able to claim that ticket if it seems like a low-hanging fruit. And then, but because of that, and then the question comes in, it's like, I wonder if there are other low-hanging fruit that I can pick. So I look into the issue log, and then it's really well organized. I think it's the same for a lot of other open source library nowadays that hosted in GitHub. They tell you which ones are ready for contributing and which ones are ready for starters or intermediate. So I just found a few, pick one, and then trying to play around with it. I'd say the biggest takeaway that surprised me is that it's not that much different than your day-to-day work as a software developer. It's quite similar. It's like you see a ticket, it's either ask you to add this small feature or ask you to change the behavior to fix that bug. In the beginning, you are probably not familiar with the code base, so you kind of try to locate which part of the code exactly does that. And with some investigation, you realize, oh, this is the part. And then you try to see why it's not doing what you want it to do. So you put a debugger or you play around in the console and try out different test cases. And then after sometimes you kind of get really familiar with the context and you know what's wrong. And most of the case, when you understand how it's doing what it's currently doing, it's pretty easy to just make the change you want. So it's really similar to my day-to-day work. In my work, there's something we call Viking Master, which is basically on-call rotation where an engineer go in and fix tickets reported either internally or externally by customer. A lot of times you pick a ticket and the code that is related to the ticket is not written by you, it's written by some other developer in the past time. And you kind of just dive into that code that you're not familiar with and spend some time with it. After a while, you get familiar with it and you know how to fix it. So I would say if you were like me, who was really intimidated by the open source, the whole idea of the open source software, just give it a try. It's not so much different than your day-to-day job as a developer. And if you are not a professional developer yet, I would say contributing to open source library is a great way to level up your debugging skill and also learn the best practice from those open source projects.
I couldn't say it better myself. I've over the years, I think that I started off very nervous about contributing because I've never felt that I'm a great developer, and to this day, I still don't feel like I'm a great developer. I'm moderate at best. But the thing that I do know is these maintainers, these people maintaining these open source projects are overloaded. So, and one of the things that really does help is going through and cleaning up old issues that need to probably be retested and say, is this still an issue? An experience that I've had, and it actually led me to being one of the documentation maintainers of Ember. I'm no longer that, but I was at a conference and Tom Dale was there and he mentioned that he was showing the docs and, oh, that's a bug, we need to fix that. And so like right there during the talk, I pulled their repo, I made the fix, I submitted a PR. And after that, they're like, wow, that was really nice. Let's get you to do some more. And I found and I was one of the developers on the Grails project in their documentation site as well, where I just said, hey, I want to help. I don't know how I can help, but I want to help. And I just started pitching in, and eventually they said, yeah, here, help build this. And I helped build their website. So being a good developer, let me rephrase that. Being an experienced, advanced developer is not a requirement for working on open source. It's actually an excellent way to become better because all of a sudden you're getting feedback on code that you contribute from the experts. Mm-hmm. So it's a wonderful way to do it. But if anybody is looking to get into open source and help, I recommend starting off with the documentation and helping there. My final example, and this is just a habit that I get into, like I recently tried to figure out how to deploy a Phoenix app to Heroku, and I found that there was a discrepancy in their documentation. So I pulled down the Phoenix repo, I modified their documentation, and I submitted a PR with an explanation, and they accepted it. So it's pretty cool because like I have a contribution to the Phoenix library, and yet it was just something that like I felt it should be there, but nobody would have thought of it unless they ran into the use case that I ran into. Mm-hmm. So anyway, there's many ways to get into that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I would say, especially if you're concerned about your own experience not have that many years of programming experience. So, and then you worry that you may not be skillful enough to contribute. I would say being a not so senior developer actually gives you some unique advantage because you come with a fresh eyes. A lot of things people take it for granted, like how they have been doing programming for so long. They don't realize something actually doesn't make sense. But because you come with a fresh eyes, you may ask questions that you think is stupid, but actually get people start thinking, or you see that missing method that people already get used to a different way to doing things, but you see that, it's missing. If we have a different method here, our life will be much easier. So these are the very unique perspectives that you can bring in and contribute to the community. And I believe all community needs that, no matter how mature or how young it is. Fresh perspective is always something that's very valuable.
Absolutely. So you have a blog post that you wrote, which is basically a letter to the self-doubting developer. And I found that fascinating. I think we've all been through it. We've all gone through this imposter syndrome. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You go over some lessons that you've learned, and can you share those?
Yeah, definitely. I actually wanted to bring it up when we were earlier talking about experienced developer versus not so experienced, or best developer versus intermediate. I'd say just the first lessons I learned is to realize learning how to program or on your journey of becoming a better developer is really similar to how you build muscles. Because if you think about it, when you build muscle, you may go to the gym and you do those workouts and you feel the pain, the sore in your muscle. And you just take a few days of break, maybe to let your muscle to grow, and then you become stronger, and then you go back there, and then you kind of hurt yourself again to break those muscles down so it can rebuild itself and become stronger. It's very similar in the programming sense. When you learn to program on a journey to become a better developer, a lot of times you feel that it doesn't make sense and you get stuck, and then your brain literally hurts. And then, but as you stick along with the problem longer, it's starting to make sense. And then that moment just click, and then you realize, that's why. And it makes a lot of sense after you realize what exactly is happening. And then you kind of level up a little bit compared to yourself before that challenge. And the process is very similar, and then you kind of go back to a different challenge, maybe a bigger one, and then your brain hurts again, and then things doesn't make sense, and you're starting to question everything. And as you stick longer as well, you gain more context around that problem. You learn some new things, and then it makes sense again, and then you level up. So the cycle is really similar. You started with a bigger challenge that is bigger than, maybe a little bit bigger than your current skill set, and then your brain hurts, and then things doesn't make sense. You're starting to question a lot of things. But then you move on to the next phase after you spend more time in the challenge and you learn more things and things make sense again. Then you move on to the next challenge. So it's very similar to building muscles. But one thing that is lacking is that when you build muscle, when you go to the gym, people tell you that that's what you should expect. You should expect your muscle hurts. You should expect that you feel tired. You may feel frustrated. But when you learn program, especially if you are not from in like surrounded by people who's also learning program, you may feel that maybe it's just me, and then you start questioning is it because I'm not good enough or things like that. But people don't tell you that actually that's what you should expect. You should expect things doesn't make sense, and you should expect your brain hurts, and you should expect a period of time you're just kind of struggling with that challenge, with that problem you're trying to solve. I think once you realize that it's actually common, that's how you learn and how to level up your skill, you will have less self-doubt. It's not so much about you, about your genes, about how smart you are. It's just the process that all of us go through.
Yeah, the brain hurting thing. I remember I would, especially when you're learning a new language, I would end the day and I would go talk to my wife. I'm like, I am dead. My brain hurts so bad, and it's not something I enjoy. But you're right; it's like a muscle, and you just got to keep on working at it. And it can also atrophy if you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So, one other question I had is, you went 3 years ago from just barely starting the program, and as I understand it, you got 6 job offers from some of the biggest companies in the world. Tell us about that process.
Yeah, totally. So I graduated about 2 years ago out of college, and my university is called the University of Texas at Dallas. So I received like great educations from there, but it's not like those famous CS program like CMU or Stanford and anything like that. So I would say I went through the whole journey from in the beginning. It's really hard to get anyone's attention to the end. Before my graduation, I was lucky enough to receive all those great offers from those great companies. The journey, I would say, it's just a lot about building your skill sets and having proof to show those companies what you are capable of. And that's why I went to 3 different internships and learned a lot there. And also building side projects along the way, just to demonstrate that I am capable of learning things on my own. I'm capable of building these apps and basically convey something from an idea to a final product that is that people can use. And so that's one side of the story, being you go through the journey of building up your story to show people you are a capable developer. And the other side of the story, of course, is like once you get your resume into the door, you need to pass those programming interviews. And that's not my favorite thing in the world, but it's something we all have to face. And basically, I just spend a lot of time preparing for those interview questions and eventually get myself good enough at solving those questions and just pass lots of the interviews.
Do you have any tips on where people can go to prepare for those interviews?
Yeah. So just a disclaimer, I'm not advocate for the current way we do programming interviews, being like either whiteboarding or have a coding challenge that is somewhat disconnect from real world programming challenge. But that's the way it is. And it's going to take a while for the industries to change or come up with a better way to evaluate our skills. With that being said, that's the status quo. And if you want to get a job, it's very likely that you have to go through one of those coding interviews. One website I find quite helpful is called LeetCode. It's LEET code. Has a lot of coding challenge there. And what I did is I basically categorized them based on the type of the skill they are testing and just focus on one category for a period of time until I feel that I'm quite familiar with maybe recursion, and then move on to the next category, maybe it's dynamic programming. When I started, there were only about 200 questions. Last time I checked, there were like 800. So it's gone crazy, all the coding interview game.
Another thing I can recommend is exorcism.
Yes.
And I think exorcism is also a great way to learn some of those exercises that might come up. So we're coming up on an hour. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we get to picks?
Great question. I would say I would like to go back to the self-doubting developer topic about imposter syndrome. One thing I also want to emphasize is that don't focus so much on how good you are or how unskilled you are, because no matter how good you are, there are people better than you, and there are people that can learn from you. So it's not a binary thing. You're either good or not good, but it just put yourself into a spectrum, and there's always opportunity for you to grow, and there's always people can learn from you. So instead of focusing on yourself, just focus on your craft. If you think maybe I'm not so good, ask yourself like which are the areas that you can improve, and just maybe it's system design, and then go learn on those topics and focus on the code you write, but not so much how good you are or how, I'd say focus on your craft, but not yourself, can help you stop worrying about if you are good enough.
That's great advice. Great advice. We can all take it. Okay, so let's go to picks.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
So I'm going to go ahead and share mine. I got a couple of picks. The first one I have is a company that I work with called Gitcoin. And Gitcoin is, we talked a little bit about contributing to open source and how it does build you up. Well, what Gitcoin does is they provide a way for developers to actually generate revenue while contributing to open source.
Wow.
So it's a pretty neat system. Basically, you go there, they have a list of issues that you can take in all these different languages. And once you complete them and submit a PR, you can get paid out. So it's a nice way to get involved in open source and in the same time generate a little bit of money for yourself. So that's my first pick. And my second pick is I had a conversation this morning. I meet a buddy every Tuesday for lunch. And I'm sorry, not for lunch, like for early morning coffee. And when we met, I told him this habit that I've got into at night. So my wife and I, we put the kids down, then we go to bed, and it's our time to relax, right? It's our time to kind of unwind and relax and let the day kind of go away and just enjoy the evening where it's really quiet and everything. And I found a form of meditation that I didn't expect to find in cross stitching. So I'm like fanatic about cross stitching now, where I'm creating like designs, and I can basically all night long when my little fingers are working back and forth inside this cross stitching and building these fun little designs that are like super geeky, right? I'm creating cross stitches of Bob's Burgers characters. I mean, silly stuff, but there's something to be said about just letting your hands do the work, and at the end of the day, you have something that you built that you can look at. But it's so meditative to just sit there and just go back and forth in the cross stitch and just let your hands build, and your mind doesn't really need to work at all.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. Absolutely. It's a lot of fun. And eventually once I'm done, I'll share my cross stitches on a website. So anyway, I recommend it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for the picks. I love both of your picks. I'm definitely going to check out how you can contribute to open source and also earn some side income. That sounds really interesting. And I'm looking into getting like the meditation practice as well. So thanks for recommending that. I'm definitely going to check that out.
You bet.
So for my pick, I'd say the first pick is a free course online provided by Stanford. It's called Human Behavioral Biology. I actually only watched the first lecture so far, but I really love it. One thing that the professor talks a lot about in the first lecture is about categorical thinking. I find that fascinating. He spent about 40 minutes just talk about categorical thinking and why it may not be the best idea to tackle some problem, basically the pitfalls. So categorical thinking is something human naturally do. We basically categorize things that helps us easier to process all those information. And when things come, we just see which category they fit in and how we should solve that problem. But there are a lot of pitfalls being, if something that doesn't fit into the category very well, our brain may not pick it up easily. We may overlook it. So I would definitely recommend people to check out the first lecture of the course named Human Behavioral Biology. A lot of things I found is quite relatable to how we develop software, being how we think about edge case, how we approach this design hierarchy and things like that. The way he talks about how to avoid categorical thinking is really applicable to our day-to-day job, actually. So I find that fascinating. And my second pick being a course in Udemy. It's called Minute Habit Mastery. Basically, it's the idea that you build a habit not by committing to maybe exercise 1 hour per day. That's something quite daunting and hard to stick to, but maybe just one push-up per day. And that's so small that's almost laughable. But in the course, it goes a lot into the psychology behind it. And I find that fascinating. Learn a lot about how we think about things, how humans think about things. Actually, it's not so much about how the task, how complicated itself it is, but how the perceived complexity we see. So I believe a lot of us have the trouble of procrastination, and sometimes it's not so hard about actually get the job done, but it's about sitting yourself down and start working on it. But once you start working on it, it's not, you will start getting into the flow and enjoy doing it. But getting yourself sit down and start doing that task is the tough part. And building those mini habits to get yourself started, and then you can decide if you want to continue or not. I find it's a pretty good strategy. So I recommend people to check it out, just learn about the psychology behind it. I find it quite helpful in combating procrastination and also starting to build all those habits I want to build for a long time.
Love it. I've actually bookmarked that course. I'm going to end up buying that. I can definitely use better habits.
Yeah, habits are great things.
Yes, they are. So where can our listeners find you? On your website, Twitter? What accounts do you have? Where can they reach out to you?
Totally. I blog regularly on the topic of Ruby and software development and anything I learned at work. And my personal blog is called Sihui.io, and it's spelled as SIHUI.io. So people can go there and check out some of the article I wrote before. And also feel free to follow me on Twitter. My Twitter token is Sihui_IO. Again, SIHUI_IO.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we'd like to thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm sorry the rest of the team isn't here. I'd like to thank our sponsors for helping make this podcast possible. It wouldn't be possible without you guys. And thank you all for listening. And we'll see you. Talk to you next week.
See you.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.